Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to all of you here in the room and to many folks who are joining us online today. Happy to be here with so many of you for a fantastic discussion that we have for you. My name is Maura Policelli. I'm Associate Professor of the Practice here at the Keough School and the Executive Director for our Washington office, where I'm based. And it's my profound pleasure to be hosting today's conversation, especially because it involves my good friend, Dan Runde from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today's discussion on global leadership through soft power. As most of you know here in the room, but others online may not know, the Keough School addresses some of the world's greatest challenges with particular emphasis on the design and implementation of effective and ethical responses to poverty, conflict, political oppression, environmental degradation, and other threats to dignity and human flourishing. Those solutions often, not always, but often involve policy. In keeping with Notre Dame's mission to place scholarship in service to the common good, the Keough School advances integral human development through research, policy, and practice. We are committed to engaging policy practitioners, like Dan Runde, who's with us today, in the international development sector in order to connect our research, faculty expertise, and students to the practical challenges of shaping policy solutions that can improve the lives of the most vulnerable. That is why the Keough School has a Washington, D.C. office where our students and faculty can engage with development practitioners and policymakers, and why we, on occasion, like today, bring Washington to South Bend. Washington is by no means the only city where important global policy takes shape, but it is certainly an important one. Thus, it's my honor to introduce Dan Runde, whose new book, The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power, his book makes the case for the U.S. to make bold investments in foreign assistance, and it offers practical reforms to allow the U.S. government to be more coordinated, strategic, and effective around the world. Dan Runde is a senior vice president, a director of the Project on Prosperity and Development, and holds the William A. Chair in Global Analysis at CSIS. As most of you know, CSIS is one of the world's preeminent public policy institutions on foreign policy and national security. Mr. Runde's work is oriented around U.S. leadership in building a more democratic and prosperous world. Among his many contributions, Mr. Runde has been the architect of the BUILD Act, which established the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. He contributed to the reauthorization of the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and he was an architect of Prosper Africa, a U.S. government initiative to deepen the United States commercial and development engagement in Africa. He has been a leading voice on the role and future of the World Bank Group and U.S. leadership in the multinational system. Prior to CSIS, Mr. Runde held leadership roles at the U.S. Agency for International Development and the World Bank Group. He serves on multiple international boards and committees. He's a columnist for The Hill and hosts a podcast at CSIS. So with that, I will turn things over to Mr. Runde to give some highlights from his fantastic book, and then we'll have a discussion following his presentation. Over to you, Dan.
Maura, thank you so much. You have no idea how thrilled I am to be here at Notre Dame. I launched this book in February. I've given 27 book talks so far. This is by far my favorite book talk. I'm so thrilled to be in South Bend. I love Notre Dame. I love the Keough School. I think it's got a really important footprint in Washington. I think there's some really fine scholars here at the Keough School that I take really seriously and I listen to. Folks like my friend Josh Eisenman, who's here. Thanks, Josh, for being here. I think what you do is really important work. I podcasted you, and have just done really important stuff. People like Ray Offenheiser, who is a social entrepreneur and a real leader and builder. You're very fortunate here at Notre Dame to have such fine scholars. I'm really grateful for my partnership with Maura Policelli in Washington. And I just think the Keough School is really ably led by Dean Appleby. I'm really happy to see Dean Appleby. Thank you for being here. So let me, I want to just clarify a couple things at the beginning. I want to tell a story and then I'll go through some slides. So the first is that I'm going to use the word China and I'm going to use the word Russia. So when I say the word China, I want you to think the Chinese Communist Party. So if I hear the word China, I want you to think Dan is saying the Chinese Communist Party. We do not have a problem with the Chinese people. If I say the word Russia, what I'm referring to is the murderous regime led by Vladimir Putin and his inner circle of war criminals. That's what I'm referring to. I'm not talking about the Russian people. We need to have some ability to engage with those people who do not support Vladimir Putin's murderous regime, and we need to figure out ways to do that. So when you hear Russia and you hear China, I want you to give me a hall pass on that okay? And so I'm asking for a hall pass on that, okay? That's the first thing. Okay, so let me tell you a story. So you all remember COVID? I hated COVID. You all hate COVID? I hated COVID. It was horrible. So several things happened in COVID that I think, as a result, that I think have accelerated a number of things in the book. This was my COVID project. I'm going to tell us. You all got vaccines. I got Pfizer and I got Moderna, and you all got vaccines, right? So there was a time when there was a period when there was a shortage of Pfizer and Moderna for about 12 months. So the folks who got Pfizer and Moderna, there were a number of countries that got Pfizer and Moderna, and a lot of other countries didn't get Pfizer and Moderna. So since then, in the last 2 years, we've flooded the zone in terms of having the good stuff, in terms of providing the good vaccines. But there was a 12-month period where we did not provide the good stuff, the top shelf vaccines. So I testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the issue of vaccine diplomacy in the Americas about a year ago. And I went and talked to a number of embassies and ambassadors in Washington. They're friends of mine. And I said, okay, so tell me a little bit about your vaccine experience. And so some of my friends, I'm not going to necessarily say they said this, but let's put it. So I'm going to call this as highly believable anecdotes. Okay. So this is highly believable in the anecdotal phase, and I testified to it. So I believe these to be true. So the Dominican Republic is a wonderful country. The DR had stopped recognizing the country of Taiwan and had decided to recognize mainland China. The Dominican Republic had also said, as the country of the Dominican Republic, are not going to include Huawei, which is an important telecoms company. Many of you have heard of Huawei, right? In our telecom system in the Dominican Republic. So then COVID happens, and they are out of luck. And we say to them, hey, you want Pfizer, you want Moderna, take a number, and in about 12 months, we'll get you some of those vaccines. Think about how you would feel if that was you. So China comes and said, I've got Sinovac for you. I'll give you some Sinovac. But I've heard this rumor that you're thinking about changing from the mainland to recognizing Taiwan. I can't believe you would do something like that. Oh, no. So that didn't happen. They stayed with the mainland. The other thing they said to the Dominican Republic was, we've got this really fine telecoms company called Huawei. We would love to have Huawei in your telecom system. We're giving you these vaccines. Wouldn't you want to reconsider that? And they reconsidered it. The same thing happened in Brazil. Brazil had said, we're not going to include Huawei in our telecom system, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And then they were short vaccines. And Sinovac said, we'll do a partnership with you and we'll make Sinovac vaccines in Brazil. But we'd really like you to reconsider that decision on Huawei. And they did. Finally, there's a story about El Salvador recognized the mainland instead of Taiwan. Guatemala, which shares a border with El Salvador, chose to stay recognizing Taiwan. So El Salvador got a lot of Sinovac vaccines. Guatemala was told, hey, just wait 12 months and we'll get you some Moderna and Pfizer. So China and El Salvador did vaccine campaigns on the border with Guatemala, just across the river. So you could see it saying, if we only recognize the mainland, we'll get these vaccines. That's a form of power, right? That's a form of influence. So when some Republicans in Washington, some foreign policy folks, this soft power stuff, that's kind of mushy. That's kind of fuzzy. I don't think so. I mean, if you listen to this just strikes me as a lot of influence. This is really important stuff. So this is sort of an anecdote at the kinds of things we're experiencing. So my point to you is, and the point of my book is that the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's murderous regime can fill voids today that they couldn't 20 years ago. They can fill voids in vaccines. They can fill voids in the digital space. They can fill voids in infrastructure. They can fill security voids. You've heard of the Wagner Group. Some of you have heard of the Wagner Group. Well, they can do a lot of damage. They can fill values voids. They can fill infrastructure voids. They have influence in the multilateral system. And they're also now becoming an attractive place for international education and study, which I would argue is actually a really important thing. And I said, Notre Dame, I think, has a 10% undergraduate international student body. That's really good. That's a good thing. But mainland China is becoming an attractive place for international study. And I always ask, I've visited 80 countries in my professional career. I always ask the leadership, where do you send your elites to study? And if they say Moscow and Beijing, which sometimes I hear, I get nervous. If they say South Bend, I feel a lot better. So I think you get the idea about what I'm saying. Let me just make one more point and then I'll run through some slides. So unfortunately, we're not in the post-Cold War age anymore. We're in an age of great power competition. Some people would say we're in a second Cold War. So I did Newt Gingrich's podcast. I did Hugh Hewitt's talk radio show as part of my book tour. And both of them said, I liked your book, but I disagree with this one point. You say we're in an age of great power competition. I would say we're in a second Cold War. We can debate that. I'm a little bit eschewing the term second Cold War because I think it's got a lot of baggage to it. And it has a little bit of a finality, like we can't kind of get out of it. I'm hoping we're going to be able to, not go there. But whatever you want to use, whatever term you want to use, I would argue that if it's an age of great power competition, here's what I would suggest. The first is that great power competition is not going to happen in China. It's not going to happen in Russia. It's going to happen in Africa. It's going to happen in Latin America. It's going to happen in Southeast Asia. It's going to happen in the Pacific Island states. It's going to happen in Central Asia. It's going to happen in places like Ukraine and Moldova. That's where it's going to play out. Most of it, hopefully, is not a military competition. It's going to be a competition of values. It's going to be a competition around infrastructure. It's going to be a competition around technology. It's going to be a competition around vaccines. So if that's the case, if you buy what I'm selling, then what I would argue is that we need a new strategy with our friends and allies. What's our superpower, right? The young people use that term, our superpower. What's our superpower? Our superpower is we've got friends and allies. And anything the United States has ever done, we've only done with friends and allies. So what I would argue is we first need we have a bipartisan consensus in Washington that we have a challenge with the Chinese Communist Party and we have a challenge with Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. What we don't have in Washington yet is a consensus on what the heck to do about it. So the reason I wrote this book was to begin a national conversation and maybe even a global conversation about what the heck do we do about this? So that's why I wrote this book. So let me go through the slides and then I know we'll have a really interesting conversation. Look, so let me start with the following. If you take the long view, if you go back to 1980, okay, there's lots of things to point out. If you read the newspaper, you want to just cry, right? There's everything, there's terrible news, and I'm not going to deny that. But if you take the long view from, say, 1980, the world's a richer, freer, healthier place with a lot more agency. And at the same time, there's a bunch of kind of problems. One is we've got 30 or 40 fragile and failed states. There's a wonderful book called The Bottom Billion by Paul Collier. Many of you have read it. If you haven't, I encourage you to read it. And then we've got this new overlay of what I've just described to you of great power competition. That's how I would describe kind of the world outside of our doors. Again, the China challenge, the Chinese Communist Party challenge, okay? Look, they have the ability to fill voids. Who's heard of Belt and Road here? Everyone heard of Belt and Road? Let me see hands. Yeah, a lot of people heard of Belt and Road. All 100 U.S. senators have heard of Belt and Road. They're not sure exactly what it is, but they don't like it. All 100 U.S. senators have heard of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. They've heard of it. They're not sure exactly what it is, but they don't like that either. So I can tell you that, this has started, beginning to penetrate folks' minds. Okay, so 25 years ago, the United States was the largest trading partner for 120 countries. Today, China's the largest trading partner for 135 countries. So if you're their largest trading partner, are you willing to say like, hey, I'm angry with you, or hey, I'm going to sanction you, or hey, I'm going to vote against you in the United Nations? What would you do? It's much harder if you're the largest trading partner, right? It's a constraint. China, let's be very clear. China is absolutely bankrolling Russia's war crimes and illegal war on Ukraine every day. They are betraying. I could use other words, but since this is a family seminar, I'm going to use betray. They are betraying the Ukrainians every day in the United Nations. They're betraying the Ukrainians every day in the G20, watering down statements, abstaining, which basically means like a stabbing the Ukrainians. That's what they're doing. They're not friends of the Ukrainians. They would like the Russians to win. Xi Jinping visited Moscow a day after Vladimir Putin was declared a war criminal by the International Criminal Court. Who does that? Who does that? It's disgusting. So ultimately, though, this is not going to be a military competition. So ultimately, it's about what is our positive, forward-looking agenda that we're going to offer. Because if we don't, other people can fill the void today. It's different than 10 years ago or 15 years ago. When I started in Washington 20 years ago, this wasn't a thing, right, as the young people say. When I was in the Bush administration, this wasn't a thing. Today, it's for real, and it's part of the furniture. Okay, so I'm going to use several terms in my talk. So there's three terms I'm going to use. I use in my book. There's soft power, which I'm going to get to. There's international development, which is a term, which is about a series of different measures of progress, on economic progress, political progress, health and literacy, other quality of life measures. These are domestically driven and interrelated. I also talk about foreign aid, which is a way in which the United States and others support the enterprise of development. I also use the term soft power. Now, there are several definitions of soft power. Joseph Nye, who was my dean at Harvard, wrote a book called Soft Power. And it's about kind of attraction and shaping choices. And he talks about that. I use the term in a slightly different way, and I give you several buckets of things that I'm talking about here. So it's not the totality of it. I exclude some things like trade, certain forms of foreign assistance. So what I would say is that we need to think about various forms of our non-military power. My argument is that we need to have an agenda that's positive and forward-looking and speaks to the hopes and aspirations of others. And if we don't, they're going to take their business somewhere else. That's what I tell presidential candidates. That's what I tell policymakers. Okay, we talk about foreign assistance. Okay, why do we give foreign assistance? Why did we do the Marshall Plan? In 1961, why did John F. Kennedy reform our foreign assistance? Because we were in an age of great power competition then. There's a really important book that I would also encourage you all to read. Now, many of you probably read it when you were growing up, called The Ugly American. Who read The Ugly American growing up? Anybody here? Ugly American? John F. Kennedy read I would say The Ugly American, it published in 1958, is the most important book, foreign policy book of the second half of the 20th century. The Ugly American. John F. Kennedy was so shaken by it, he bought 100 copies and gave one to every member of the US Senate. When he became president, because of that book, he did 4 things. He started the Peace Corps. He reformed the US Information Agency. He reformed foreign aid. He did 5 things. He produced an initiative called the Alliance for Progress, which is well remembered in the Western Hemisphere, a specific initiative for the Western Hemisphere. And he started something called the Green Berets, right? He started the Green Berets, all because of the book, The Ugly American. So we've always been involved in foreign assistance as an act of enlightened self-interest. And I would argue today that it's in our enlightened self-interest to think anew about these different forms of our influence. Okay, so a couple of things. I think we, a big part of our future is going to be in Africa. There are 1 billion people in Africa today. 25 years from today, there'll be more citizens of Africa than all the citizens of India and mainland China combined. There are 300 million folks in the middle class in Africa today and 700 million cell phones. So I think it's great that President Biden hosted so many African leaders in December, and we're seeing a wave of leaders from the Biden administration going to Africa. This is a good thing. It's smart. The second thing, and this is something Maura Policelli knows a lot about, is we're going to be a lot of the kinds of places where we're going to be working in the world in global development are going to be in fragile states. And it's going to require a different kind of an approach. And it's going to be harder and it's going to be more of a slog. But we're going to have to think differently, and I talk about it in my book. The other thing is that, the kinds of things that our friends are that speak to our friends' hopes and aspirations are changing. This isn't your grandparents' developing world. It's not even your parents' developing world. It's rich, as I said, richer, freer, healthier, with more agency, a lot more agency. What our partners want is a lot more science and technology from us. They want more higher education partnerships from us. They want more infrastructure. They would like a deeper partnership of trade and investment. And we need to respond to that. And then I think the kinds of partnerships we're going to have need to think about, we need to think about that ultimately aid is not really is not on its own what we need. What we need is some kind of we need to have partnerships that are beyond assistance, and we need to work with our friends in ways that support moving beyond that in ways where they become partners with us in the current system that we have. Because what I would argue is a lot of this is about plugging partners and friends into the current system that was set up after World War II. And what I would argue is the Chinese Communist Party is hoping to set up an alternate system that if you did a thought experiment and you thought about what that was really like, do a thought experience of having the world led by the Chinese Communist Party, if you spent about 2 minutes thinking about it, you'd say, you know what? I actually, hard pass, I don't actually want that. But we never thought that through because we're like fish in water operating in the system that's been set up since after World War II. If there's a world led by the Chinese Communist Party, no one's going to like it. No one in this room is going to like it. No one's going to like it. Okay. So let me just talk about a couple of things about some examples. Okay, well, what is some examples of soft power that's actually worked? Well, the intelligence community looked at HIV/AIDS in Africa and said, this is going to be a national security problem for not just our friends in Africa. It's not going to be a health problem. This is going to become a national security problem. And so when George Bush, the son, Bush 43, became president, he read this information. He also, as a committed Christian, felt that this was something that all people deserve human dignity. And this is a place at Notre Dame where this is, we talk about integral development at Notre Dame. We talk about human dignity at Notre Dame. So it spoke to his heart. It also spoke to his head. And so he spent his political capital in creating something called the President's Emergency Partnership for AIDS Relief. It's now gone on for 20 years, and it's changed the world. And so he's led a global coalition to provide medicine and to support different kinds of behavioral changes to support and has saved almost 20 million lives and has been an important part of changing the trajectory of Africa. That's among other things, but it was an important contribution. So that was a lot of political will and that was a 20-year project. Okay. So another one is Colombia. How am I doing on time? Okay. I'm okay? Okay. So in the late 90s, the intelligence community put together some analyses that said that the Marxist guerrillas of Colombia, financed by drugs, illicit drug use, had the ability to invade Bogota and take over the country. Now, this sitting here today, that seems a little weird, but for those of us old enough to remember this, that wasn't so crazy. So the Clinton administration, in partnership with the Colombian government and in partnership with the Republican Congress, came to an agreement to say, we cannot have a Marxist guerrilla group take over the entire country of Colombia and turn it into some complete, full-on narco state. It's not in their interest, and it's not in our interest. So the United States, in partnership with the Colombian government, across multiple administrations and across multiple Republican and Democratic administrations and across Republicans and Democrats in Congress, made a 20-year commitment to help support leaders in Colombia who had decided to take on the challenge of dealing with the root causes of the guerrilla fight, to bring the guerrilla groups to heel, and to also try and address some of the root causes, but also to marshal political will in the country of Colombia to take this on. And I would argue what happened was that it became harder and harder in many countries in Latin America, places I like very much. If you're in the elite, you just say, well, I'll just get an extra bodyguard, or I'll use a helicopter, and I can just avoid all this stuff. At some point, it became so messed up in Colombia that you couldn't really do that anymore. And so as a result, you had sort of a shift in mindset among the elites to say, okay, now I'm ready to take this on. There's not enough helicopters, there's not enough bodyguards, there's not enough armed cars for us to fix this. We're gonna have to do something more drastic. I can't just go to Miami for the weekend and just get a break, right? And that's what happened. That's the truth. So as a result, there was a shift and a willingness to spend political capital to confront the profound problems of Colombia that had festered for about 50 years. There's still challenges in Colombia. I'm not super happy with the current government, frankly. I've known several of the presidents of Colombia. President Duque is someone I admire very much. President Uribe is like, the Winston Churchill of the Western Hemisphere, someone I really admire. I had dinner with him a couple of weeks ago. And I just, this guy, the current guy, is not my favorite, but it speaks to the fact that Colombia is such a success and look, we got to listen to the Colombian voters. Doesn't mean I don't get a vote. I'm not a voter in Colombia. It's not their society, that it's this big enough a success story. They can risk having such a chucklehead as president. Sorry, but anyway, so I shouldn't say that. But really, he's it's an incredible success story in an incredible place. Okay, so here's my message, which is that the U.S. and our allies need to offer a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of other countries as an alternative to a Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin partnership in developing countries. Because today, the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin have the ability to fill voids that we leave behind. So leadership is a choice, and I'm arguing that we need to lead. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
out of the way, and then you.
I want to make sure you're the center of attention.
Oh,
Do you want to?
oh, thank you.
Okay, and we can.
Great. So thank you very much, Dan, for your presentation. And now we're joined by Professor Josh Eisenman, who is an expert on Chinese politics, especially Chinese engagement in Africa. So between the two of us, we're going to ask you some follow-up questions, and then our students will definitely have an opportunity as well to get you some, toss you some questions. So I'm going to dive in with, I don't think this is by any means an elephant in the room, but possibly, which is the U.S. has certainly been, I think, justly criticized for its exceptionalism, American exceptionalism around the globe. Our interventions, our engagements in many places
Haven't worked out so well.
has not worked out so well. So your book is about the American imperative. So how do you suggest that the U.S. have possibly some humility as we fill, as you say, fill some voids, or make sure that China doesn't fill some voids that that exist right now globally?
So Maura, if it's okay, I call you Maura.
Of
Okay,
course.
thanks. Okay, so I keep thinking I should call her Professor Policelli. I think she's.
It's awkward.
It's
Just
okay.
call me Maura.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. So Maura, I think what I would say is that. So I just finished a book on the history of Haiti, called "Written in Blood: The History of Haiti Since the 1600s." And if you have, you ought to go read it. It's a tough book to read. It's tough. The U.S. had 30 interventions in the 19th century in Haiti. 30. I couldn't believe it. We then were there multiple times in the early 20th century. And so, so I think we've got to we need to have some humility. So I appreciate you asking me this question, because I think it is an elephant in the room. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was, I think I worry about folks on the right, and I worry about progressive folks on the left, who, for a variety of reasons, are concerned about America being engaged in the world. So some people on the left would say, like, we're too militarized, and it's too. We've got to kind of rethink that. There are other critiques, and I think they're legitimate, and we need to listen. But I think separately on the right, what I would describe it as, like, I think some of the things that Donald Trump spoke to in the 2016 election was what I would describe as sort of like, quote unquote, the endless wars critique. I think that I would describe that there's been, I haven't met anybody in Washington who says, I am ready for mainland China to lead the world. I haven't met anyone that says, I am cool with that. I haven't met anybody, anyone, the most MAGA-hatted isolationist person. I've yet to have somebody say, like, I am cool with mainland China running the world. What I do here is, we would like a timeout on global leadership, or we would like to renegotiate the terms of burden sharing. So I think this issue is, we need to have some humility. I do think that we are not so great in situations where we're not fully welcomed. Let me put it that way. But at the same time, there are going to be situations where we are, I think we're going to continue to operate in very complicated and fragile contexts that may get more fragile and more complicated. And so I think we need to operate with some degrees of humility and caution. But I think that you're asking an important question, and I suspect it's a question on the minds of many of the listeners in here. So I appreciate you asking that.
Jump in?
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for your talk. And I really appreciate you talking about this bipartisan consensus, because it has been hard won. Okay, and it is. This is not something that has just fallen into our laps.
No,
and especially in a place like Washington, which is, bipartisanship hard to be found. To have one on an issue like this is something that certainly I didn't see when I was in Washington, and I'm glad you mentioned it here, and the challenge now to figure out what to do with it. So let me ask you something about what to do with it, right? We have just seen a new report that just came out that showed that China has spent, over the last 5 years, $240 billion bailing out the BRI. This is not building new projects. This is bailing out the other projects that they lent money from 2010 to 2016. $240 billion essentially to bail out their own banks, because if they don't give the money to the Argentines and the Pakistanis, then they can't fulfill their loans to the Chinese banks, right? So China is in a problem right now with regard to overreach, overstretch. It's done a little too much, in fact, perhaps a lot too much. So explain to me why we should follow this lead, right? Many books have been written about overstretch for large countries, and that the big problem isn't necessarily great power rivalry. It's when you try to do too much, you spend too much domestic resources, and then ultimately you end up overstretched and spread too thin. So is the problem how to confront China, or is the problem how to do that without spending too many resources and ending up ourselves spending billions of dollars to cover our losses?
Josh, this is a great question. I think one of the great dilemmas, and I don't cover it here, but I think this is unfortunately going to be a big part of the landscape over the next 5 years, is this issue of sort of so-called this debt overhang in the developing world. We have a global development forum we do at CSIS. For the last 2 years, we've had significant focus on this issue. David Malpass is someone who spent a lot of time on this as president of the World Bank. He's stepping down, but he's really focused on this issue. And my friend Jeff Okamoto, who's the former first deputy managing director at the IMF, is also someone who's done a lot of thinking on this. Let me just say a couple of things. So we had major debt forgiveness at the end of the 1990s. The Catholic Church was very involved with this. This is the Jubilee debt forgiveness in the late 1990s. Now, the world was a simpler place. So it was like the World Bank and the IMF and European donors and big, what are called money center banks, banks like Citibank or Barclays Bank. These were the kind of banks that had all the debt and lent all the money. So fast forward, so we forgave a lot of debt. That was a really good and important thing, along with supporting HIV/AIDS work. Debt forgiveness gave space to countries in Africa to think anew about their futures. And so many countries in Africa have done really well in the last 20 years, not for a series of other reasons, but two of the reasons were debt forgiveness, some of it led by the Catholic Church, and some because of helping support things like managing things like HIV/AIDS. Okay, not the only reason, but some of them. So now we've got a situation where a lot of the debt is held by hedge funds, held by China, and a lot of it has funny small print, like what happened in Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. So you've now heard a term in Washington that's being used called debt trap diplomacy, right? This is a term Josh has heard of and Maura's heard of, many of you may have heard of, which is basically about like, okay, we'll lend you this easy money, don't read the fine print on page 24, but if you don't pay it back, I'm taking your port. And that's what happened in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, right? This famously happened. So we're in a heck of a problem, Josh, because so in the case of, for example, Pakistan, there were 25 US senators who signed a letter to the IMF head about 5 years ago saying, I don't want the plumbers and carpenters of the United States of America bailing out Pakistan on debt that they've got to the Chinese. So I think one of the questions do the American taxpayers want to bail out Chinese debt in Pakistan when they're kind of sort of our friend and kind of sort of not our friend? Like, we really got to do Pakistan a solid and bail out that debt. It's a really thorny, difficult thing. But so I do think that the issue of this debt issue is beyond kind of what I would call the realm of high finance. So I did an op-ed at the insistence of a very senior leader in a multilateral organization, which over a long lunch I had with this person who I'm not going to mention, but you can imagine who asked me to write this, talking about the fact that this is something that's now gotten to the level of sort of President Biden and Xi Jinping. But we also need to have a different, so mainland China has been doing some of this work kind of on its own, but has been unwilling to participate in multilateral discussions about kind of taking what are called haircuts and sort of write-downs on some of their debt. They've been unwilling to do it because of some of the issues you're raising that have to do with their domestic politics. So one of the things, if they write off debt in Zambia, then the same problem comes up in mainland China saying, wait a minute, why did you write off that debt in Zambia? Why don't you write off my debt here in Guangzhou? right? And so then they've got a headache or a problem. So they're unwilling to do it because of their domestic politics, something you know, as an expert on China know a lot about. So I think ultimately though, we need to have some kind of a political agreement where they actually do that. I think we need someone like President Biden to engage Xi Jinping on this. This is beyond sort of at the IMF level or sort of Secretary of Treasury. This has to be a political decision, not a technical decision. I also think several other things need to happen. We need to do a much better job of understanding like who's got what debt where. There's a lot of issues of transparency. There's a lot of funniness about how there's some very interesting academic exercises. There's aid data that College of William and Mary, Josh and Maura, I'm sure you both
comes from.
Yeah, the aid data does some really fabulous work. And Maura and Josh know them well. And I think they do some of the best work on sort of aid transparency and debt, monitoring debt. I think so one thing is that we also need to be supporting our friends in other parts of the world to kind of make smarter decisions about what money they take and when. Now, sometimes these aren't done in kind of super transparent ways. Like it's like, hey, I'm going to lend you this money, but I'm also going to give you a bribe is also kind of part of the deal. So I think we're operating on kind of Marquis of Queensberry rules. And let me just put it this way. I don't think everybody plays by Marquis of Queensberry rules. Let me put it that way. So I think it's a heck of a problem. And it's going to be a part of the landscape for at least the next 5 years, especially with a world of rising interest rates. It's going to be even more intense and more extreme. This is going to be one of the real problems of our time is this issue.
So in your book, you give very specific examples. So maybe you can share a few today, specific examples of how our U.S. foreign assistance toolkit needs to be adjusted, needs to be reformed so that it can be more effective, so that it can do, as you say, some of the long haul strategic investments in the places where this competition will be playing out. And if you could just share, because our students should definitely read, especially your last couple of chapters.
You all got to read my book.
If you're, since you'll all be running the world soon, but very concrete ways that we can just be smarter and have a longer attention span in our foreign assistance.
Okay, so I think I'm hoping that in a second Biden term or in a different administration in 2024, I think we need to do several things. And whether it's a Democratic Congress or Republican Congress, that we were just talking about this morning, there's this really impressive Democratic member of Congress who used to work at the State Department, and she's got her finger on a number of really important issues. The woman from California,
Sarah Jacobs.
Yeah, this is somebody to watch in the Democratic Party. This is a very, very impressive person. So we need to have, in fragile states, we need people to make long-term professional commitments to work in places like South Sudan for, I would argue, up to 7 years. We ought to have people who learn how to speak Urdu or speak Amharic or so speak strategic languages in places that are far away, not speak French, but speak Haitian Creole, and make long commitments to some of these places. I think in return for that, we ought to consider saying, if you do 2 7-year tours of duty in places like South Sudan or Haiti or Pakistan, though I think if you've been to Pakistan, it's a beautiful and interesting place, and I'm fascinated by Pakistan. But in a number of other places in the Horn of Africa or elsewhere, if you make this commitment, we can accelerate your retirement, sort of like the way the Navy SEALs. I think the Navy SEALs have an accelerated process. We ought to consider doing something like that. I think this goes against a lot of stuff in the Foreign Service, at the State Department. They don't like it, but I think we need to kind of revisit this. And I also think we ought to give people, if you're going to learn Bahasan Indonesian, or you're going to learn Amharic, or not French. I love French. Don't get me wrong. It's really important. Or learn Italian. I know Notre Dame is #1 in the world on Italian studies, and I love Italian. But I'm saying for some of these specific non-strategic, these important languages that not a lot of people speak, I think it's really important. So that would be the first thing. I think we need to do a better job of we need to have a different kind of a relationship between the Congress and the executive branch. If we can come to an agreement that we're in a new age of great power competition, I think it ought to allow us to have a new social compact between the Congress and the executive branch on how we finance development and diplomacy. We had it during the Cold War. It collapsed at the end of the Cold War, and we put together kind of a jerry-rigged arrangement that was sort of a Faustian bargain with a series of congressional directives, commonly known in Washington as earmarks, something you know what I'm talking about, Maura. And it's had a number of negative and bad effects in our ability to deploy people, time, and money to actual things that we need to put people, time, and money on. And instead, we're stuck in doing stuff 15 or 20 years ago when we should be kind of updating what we should put our people, time, and money on. And if we did update our people, time, and money on some things more, I would suggest the following. We need a big, major initiative on mining. Why do I say mining? So if you're going to have electric vehicles, if you're hoping to have a carbon transition, you better love mining to the tips of your toes. You better love mining in ways you have to think about mining all day long. We're going to have to increase the amount of copper mined by like 4 to 7 times the current amount of copper. We're going to have to process metals. Which country has the largest amount of metals processing in the world right now? Mainland China, 40%. So are we really going to switch our dependence on Iran, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia from mainland China? Like, I'm not up for that. So we're going to have to do something on metals processing, and we're going to have to learn to love mining in a whole new, deep way. So we're going to need foreign assistance for that. We're going to need to think about mining in a different way. We want to have a carbon transition. If you are concerned about climate change and you're not talking about mining, it's like, I don't think it's a conversation. That's point one. Second, we need a whole new initiative on digital. I do not think it's in our interest for the digital rails of the future to be owned by the unholy trinity of Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay. It's not in your interest, it's not in our interest, it's not in our friends' interest. So we need to enable an alternative. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but we need a coalition of somebody else to enable the digital rails of the future. Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay running the digital rails of the future, 5G, is a terrible outcome. So we need to deal with this debt issue that Josh has raised. We need to deal with mining, and we need to deal with digital.
Can I do a quick asterisk question on that? I know you're not a cybersecurity expert, so I don't mean to put you on the spot. But what is your one sentence argument for anybody in this room who may have TikTok on their phones?
So I'm against TikTok. I know you guys, some of you people like TikTok as kind of a naughty pleasure. You got to kick that habit, like kick smoking. Some people like smoking cigarettes 50 years ago. This is worse than smoking cigarettes. So I think this is bad news. This tracks everywhere you go. You're basically so you could say like, well, I don't care.
You're on a college campus.
So I don't care. Yeah, so I'm not making a lot of friends with this group, right? But just saying this. But I think you need to understand that they are tracking they get access to like your bank account. They get access to your email. They get to track all your movements, but they also get to know like who you're with. And who, this is like, so you're basically you're kind of making yourself available. The other thing is if they get inside that phone, like you think that phone is like off when the phone's off, that's actually like not, there's like a whole bunch of things that the bad actors can do where like the microphone's still working even when the phone's off. So we need to understand that this is a gateway to all sorts of bad stuff. So I know you guys like TikTok and watch TikTok and it's funny and whatever. But guess what? Do you know in mainland China, they restrict the use of TikTok? They only allow like a certain amount of social media, like 1 or 2 hours. Why is it allowed here it's almost like a new opium. It's almost like they're exporting something. It's almost like they're doing it on purpose. Why is it that in mainland China, you only allowed 2 hours of social media use? Why is that?
So Josh has
Am I right, Josh?
No, Josh has a question, but students, after this exchange, have your questions ready and you can start lining up at these mics so that you can jump in after this question.
When are we done here? What time?
We go till 2.
We'll go to 2. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think the reason you got some chuckles here is you're looking at my students who all handed me in a memo on what to do about TikTok yesterday.
And did they say keep it?
We had a debate in class, and maybe they can talk to you. But I think
you should give them
very
all an
few
F.
of them wanted to ban it. So anyway, but I'm just letting you know that you're talking to an audience.
I'm not preaching to the choir on this. I suspect I'm walking uphill on this one. I suspect with this crowd. Yeah.
Well, I'll let them speak for themselves.
Yeah.
I just so here's my question, right? As I look at the book, what's the role for the UN, right? And the reason I ask this is because from my perspective as somebody who studies China, I see much of what the UN is doing is actively being co-opted by China.
Thank you for asking this.
And so what is the role the UN can play? Because you've got UN development goals and all this other stuff. And I think there's a lot of people in this room and on this campus who would like to see the UN as solving problems and addressing even issues like cybersecurity and being, but so where do you see the UN fitting into this this American imperative?
Okay, thanks. Okay, so let me just, as an asterisk or parenthetical, let me just talk about cybersecurity for a second because you raised it more and you've raised it. So like if we're in the middle of a digital transformation, right? So COVID happened. You all went on Amazon. You went on and started streaming. That's called a digital transformation. You did classes online. So like we're not entering a digital transformation, we're in a digital transformation. So high-speed internet is the new electricity. And whether it's rural Maryland, whether it's Moldova, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's Mali, we're gonna close that digital divide. It's either gonna be closed by Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay, or it's gonna be closed by somebody else. It's as simple as that. Like people are gonna close it. So at the same time though, when we're in a digital world, we need cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is like it's like having locks on a door or, a bike lock, right? Or whatever. Like it's like part of the deal of being in a digital world. Like having cybersecurity is like part of the package. Okay. So on the multilateral system, the United Nations was the name of the allies who were victorious in World War II. The United Nations. Franklin Delano Roosevelt talked about the United Nations. That's where that term comes from. So let's start with that. The United Nations was built is a vessel for collective action. It's a collective action vehicle. It's a collective action vehicle for security. It's not one thing. It's not that photo where you see like all the people voting or in the Security Council or what's called the General Assembly. The United Nations there's like a series of interlocking multilateral institutions. Many of them some of them set up before World War II, but many of them afterwards, many of them built in the Cold War era. There's something like 200 of them, I think, for this conversation that we should talk. I have a chapter about the multilateral system in my book. So there's something like at least 130 of them are accredited to the United States, where we give them like what's called diplomatic immunity. There's about 130. I would argue there's about 30 that are really super duper important. That's a technical term, right? There's 30 that are super duper important. What I would call the commanding heights of the multilateral system. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. There's a series of ones that are like less with funny names that you've never heard of that are really important. So multilateral institutions do a number of things. They convey international legitimacy. They also have a lot of money. Some of them have a lot of money. Some of them set global standards. So I'm old enough to remember VHS and Beta. Many of you are too young to remember VHS and Beta, but like global standards. So I think VHS and Beta, but you got younger people would think of like the USB plugs you use for your Apple phone, right? Like different ones of those, like global standards. So, and then another set of them keep secrets. They have a lot of super duper sensitive information. Again, that's a technical term. Okay. So my view is that the multilateral system was largely built by the United States and its allies and sustained by the United States and its allies and largely works for us most of the time. So I'm going to cop to the fact I was in the Bush administration. I'm an internationalist Republican. So I'm going to cop to some critiques. But I would like to work in a bipartisan way, and I do a lot. I went to CSIS so I could work in a bipartisan. I do have a lot of friends in the Biden administration. And when I can, I work with them on things that we agree on. So, so many Republicans don't like the multilateral system for the following reasons. They say, well, they don't pay their parking tickets, or the UN is useless, or they are mean to Israel, or I got to get a permission slip from Sri Lanka before I get to defend myself, right? Those are sort of the Republican critiques of the multilateral system, right? And so let me tell you a story about it. You're asking an important question. So my point is that the multilateral system is really important. the United States needs to lead in the multilateral system. That doesn't mean everything the UN does is super hunky-dory and awesome. So, for example, Russia is the president this month of the UN Security Council. Think about that. So for the month of April, they get to kind of preside over the UN Security Council. They're committing war crimes in Ukraine. They've illegally invaded Ukraine. It's deeply offensive. But there's not a way for us to kick them out of the Security Council. There's not a way for us to say, you guys stink. You shouldn't be president of the UN Security Council. So we're stuck with this unpleasantness. It's deeply offensive. So there's some offensive and unfortunate things about the multilateral system. If we have a fit and quit, guess what? China can fill that void. So there are 15 technical agencies of the United Nations. At one point, mainland China had 4 of the 15 top leader CEO jobs and was on its way to a 5th one. And that's when the Trump administration came to me and said, Runde, I need a favor. The guy who was our US ambassador to Geneva, who I knew from politics, said, my main job is going to be the WIPO election. And I'm a fairly well-read person. Anyone here know what WIPO is? Anybody? I didn't know. So you didn't know either? Okay, good. So we're all in the same boat, right? Okay, what the heck is WIPO? Well, guess what? It's one of those 30 really important UN agencies that you've never heard of. What the heck is WIPO? So if Maura and I come up with a patent for a new bottle cap, 30 years ago, we'd have sent a blueprint to the Patent and Trade Office, and then the patent in Washington. Then they'd have sent it to Geneva to the Major League Baseball Commission of Patent and Trade Offices called the World Intellectual Property Organization. And somebody with a green eye shade would have opened up a big filing cabinet to see if Maura and I's patent was really unique because someone in Australia hadn't invented it already. Fast forward to today, it's all sitting in a cloud computer, right? And you'd send it over the internet. So you quickly get the idea that who controls that cloud computer of files of blueprints is pretty important, right? That's probably a pretty important set of information, right? 25% of the American economy is around intellectual property. So it's super important for developed economies, right? So guess what? Mainland China now has entire cadres of people who speak really good English, really good French, and have grown up in the multilateral system. They had a really competitive candidate to run WIPO. But you guys do the thought experiment. You want the CEO of WIPO having control of that big cloud computing thing of all the bottle cap patents and everything? I don't think that's such a good, people quickly got the idea that wasn't such a good thing. Or guess what? They were going to hire peoplesliberationarmy.com to run the cloud computing company, right? You think that you can absolutely see that coming. So I was involved with the White House and the State Department and others. I first said, is there a WIPO for dummies? And there wasn't a WIPO for dummies. There was a lot of technocratic gobbledygook out there. So we put together a thing like, what the heck is WIPO? Who votes for WIPO? How do you vote? Who are the candidates? What are the stakes? So we put that together. Then we convened a series of business leaders and others to say, there's 9 other candidates other than the mainland Chinese candidate. ABC, anybody but China, who's it going to be? And so we helped formulate a consensus. The point is, I got religion on this topic because of this WIPO race, and I talk about it in the book, and just say, like, if mainland China wants to run the International Checkers and Chess Club, that's fine. But I don't want them running the IMF, right? That's the message you should understand. Like, these leadership roles are really important. Multilateral institutions, it's not 1995 anymore. We're going to say, oh, these things are useless and who cares? We have to show up. We have to bring our A game. And then we need to provide leadership in partnership with our allies and friends to make sure these things are going in the right direction. Because if we don't, guess what? They're going to start going in a different direction. I 100% guarantee you're not going to like it.
So, and students, please line up if you have questions. So we talked about this a little bit this morning, Dan, but especially for this generation of students and citizens of the world, how do we connect with the Chinese people? Is there a way to avoid the negative effects of a Cold War dynamic?
So, yes.
Because I think we've all seen how in politics or in everyday life on college campuses, whether it's anti-Asian hate, whether it's policies or language from our political figures. You know, and I think there's
We gotta watch
some
it.
in politics who are very concerned that that the U.S. could get this very wrong in terms of the global competition, get it wrong in the ways that you're sounding the alarm about, but get it wrong whether it's overreach, or is it a race
Yeah.
to the bottom? Is it becoming adversarial unnecessarily?
Totally. So Maura, thank you for asking that. So I think how we treat everybody in this country is watched by the rest of the world. So if people of Asian descent feel like they're being singled out for something, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have a problem in the rest of the world. Less people are going to want to be our friends. If people in Africa feel like African Americans are being treated fairly and squarely in this country, we're going to have a problem. And so I think we need to think about, making sure that we are an imperfect society with a lot of problems, a lot of flaws. But I will just say that in a world where we need friends, how we treat everybody matters, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because people are watching us and they're watching how we behave. And if we want to have friends, they're going to take note of that. So I think that's something for us to be aware of. I do think we need to be careful. I don't want us to get into a second Cold War. So I've eschewed the term in the book. I use great power competition. But I would just say that we can overshoot this. So I think General Milley's comments I thought were actually somewhat useful at the same time. I think we shouldn't be naive. I think we've got a big challenge with mainland China, a big one. And we need to be vigilant, I guess is how I would describe it. At the same time, I think it's great that people like Josh Eisenman are going to mainland China this summer. We need people-to-people connectivity. So I think we should make people who are Chinese students in the United States, there's 300,000, they should feel welcome. We should go out of our way to be welcoming as Americans. We are hospitable and welcoming people. And I think it's one of our strengths. So I think, place like Notre Dame campus, we can all do our part and go out of our way and not be jerks to people is the first thing I'd say. The second thing is, I think the kinds of things like Josh Eisenman is leading by example and going and teaching at a Chinese university campus this summer. There's been a huge drop-off in American students studying in mainland China. I lament that. I think that if you have an interest in China, you should consider going and studying in mainland China. That's a good thing. We need to have I don't think we should go from fifth gear to zero gear in our relationship with mainland China. I'd like us to go from sort of fifth gear to third gear, I guess is how I describe it. Think of it like that. Or think of it like, when they said they were going to cut off our pills and cut off our ventilators, that was kind of grounds for kind of a divorce. And so what I would like is for mainland China to come with their new spouse to diplomatic Thanksgiving and me to come with my new spouse to diplomatic Thanksgiving. Or maybe we can sit together with our new spouses and watch our kid graduate from high school. Maybe we could even have like a blended family holiday photo together, but like, I'd like it to be kind of, friendly and not amicable. But I think we're going to have unfortunately, we're going to have a different kind of relationship. So I think we need to be respectful and we need to keep our own house in order, because I think it's not just about, it's the right thing to do, but we're being watched. So I think, Maura, you're asking a really important question. And so I think that I think we need to have the kinds of people-to-people contacts that Josh Eisenman is doing. And we should encourage that. And I think it's great that Notre Dame is leading and Josh Eisenman is doing that and representing such a fine institution as Notre Dame and being in China this summer. It's excellent.
Well, let's hope it comes together. Are there any questions we have from the students?
Student question, yeah.
Oh, okay. Do you guys want to?
Just have to get up to the microphone.
Yeah, get up to the microphone. No pressure.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for your talk. Just talking a lot about the U.S. relationship with China. I'm Lucas. I'm an architecture student and I'm very interested in global affairs. And well, a couple of weeks ago, about a month or two ago, we had this controversy with the Chinese spy balloons, right? And it was like a big embarrassment for the United States. It took us a week or two to shoot them down. They went over the whole U.S. and nothing happened until the end. How do we kind of balance between having good international relations and also having kind of hard lines where we have to show that we do have American power, we do have standards, and we're not going to allow kind of like blatant disrespects of the U.S. on the global stage?
That's a
Dan,
great.
take two questions.
We'll bunch them together. Yeah.
Get more
Thanks,
in.
Lucas.
Yeah.
Great question.
Hi, thanks again for your time today. I have a question about, I guess, soft power and soft power being looking out. I had the privilege of speaking with Ambassador David Robinson, who came to talk to one of my classes last semester. He mentioned that part of looking out is looking in, and I was curious to hear your thoughts on how we can tackle soft power, especially when a lot of the big issues that we have when it comes to diplomacy is our own allies, like Ukraine, for example, being very concerned that the U.S. is going to pull support.
That we're going to flake.
Right. And so I'm just curious to hear that, kind of the connecting the external with the internal and how we can manage that. Thanks.
That's awesome. Thanks. These are great questions. What a smart group of students. I was so happy to be here at Notre Dame.
We handpicked them.
This is you guys are good.
Those are the plans.
Invite
Okay,
only.
this is we're going according to plan. This is great. Okay, so let me start with the balloons question. Look, if you're gonna come here and like spend like a week like sitting over sensitive military installations and vacuuming up like sensitive spy stuff, that's let's call that a provocation. It's super aggressive. So there have been all sorts of things like that. I think we need to sit with them and quietly say like, this is not nice. We could use other terms, but I'm gonna go with that's not nice. And you're going to cut that out. So I thought it was appropriate that we shot it out of the sky after it was over the ocean. So I actually think I want to believe that this kind of stuff is going to stop at some point, because I think they'll keep pushing until they bump up against a hard wall. So we need to do that. I think another example is Purdue down the street here in Indiana. I think that the former president of Purdue, Mitch Daniels, someone I really admire and really look up to and like a lot, went out of his way to say, we welcome Chinese students here, but if you're gonna bully other Chinese students, you're gonna narc. I think that's you young people use that term. Like if you're gonna narc on them back home and to the Chinese Communist Party, or you're gonna get them into trouble, we're not gonna tolerate that. We're gonna throw you out. So I think we need to set some clear rules. So Ambassador Kevin Rudd, he's the former Prime Minister of Australia. He's now the Australian Ambassador to the United States. He's written an important book on the U.S.-China relationship. I consider him one of the most serious scholars, along with people like Joshua Eisenman. I think he's a really serious scholar practitioner and speaks Mandarin, served for Australia in Beijing. He's really a good guy and an impressive guy. He has established this concept of guardrails. We need to set guardrails in our relationships so that we don't overshoot. So I think trying to establish guardrails is something we're going to need to kind of do and sort of set some boundaries, saying like, hey man, this balloon stuff, that ain't on. Hey, narking on other students to get them into trouble because they're kind of democracy curious, that ain't on. Okay, so that's how I would describe that. Thank you for your question. Look, so here's my point on Ukraine. I've been to Kyiv 3 times. I'm on the board of an American investment fund for Ukraine in Moldova called the Western NIS Enterprise Fund. And I'm the director of an initiative at CSIS called the Ukraine Reconstruction Commission. So over the last year, I spent a lot of time working on Ukraine. So our goal is for Ukraine to defeat the Russians. They should be defeated strategically. You never hear the Russians say, boy, I would really like to invade Finland. And the reason that is because they got their butts kicked, I think that's the technical term, in 1939 by the Finns. So you never say, oh man, I want to do Finland. You never hear the Russians say that. There's a reason for that. What we want is for the Russians to say, I'm taking a timeout on Ukraine for the next 100 years. That was such a bad experience. I think I'm going to take a hard pass for 100 years on doing Ukraine. So that's what we want. And so I also think we want it because Russia is Robin to China's Batman. So we want a weaker Robin to have a weaker Batman and Robin duo so that the mainland China doesn't think they can do Taiwan. That's what we want. We want them to not think they can kind of easily, willy-nilly go and do Taiwan. We want them to think, well, that Ukraine thing, that didn't look so fun. Maybe I think I'll take a pass on doing Taiwan. Or I didn't like all the sanctions that happened. Boy, I didn't like how Russia became an international pariah state. What we don't want them to calculate is like, oh, I can take the hit. I can do it. So the question is the United States going to flake? So this is a really good question. So 80% of the Republican House and 80% of the Republicans in the Senate voted the right way on the Ukraine supplemental last 10 months ago, 11 months ago. So as part of my commission work, I did a session yesterday with a former Republican congressman asking this exact question. So he says that America likes a winner. So if they have a good enough spring offensive, we're not going to pull the plug on anybody. Like if we, just like this is Notre Dame. You guys like a winner, like you like a football winner. If these guys are winning on the battlefield, we'll give them all the weapons they want and all the money they need. I believe that'll be okay. So what I worry about is if there's some kind of like stalled spring offensive, I worry about that. So I do think, but I think we need to make the case to it speaks to some of this issue of this Afghanistan hangover or Iraq. It speaks to some of the things I was talking about earlier. And the reason I wrote this book is to say, like, look, there's not a single American soldier on that battlefield. The Ukrainians are willing to fight and die for their freedom. They're fighting and dying for democracy. This guy, Vladimir Zelensky, has saved the transatlantic alliance, and he is an amazing voice for democracy. I think it's fantastic the support Notre Dame has provided for Ukraine. Archbishop Boris Gudziak spoke at the graduation ceremony. He is a friend of mine, and he's on my commission. He's a personal friend of mine. He's amazing. If you haven't gone and seen that video, you should stop what you're doing and watch that graduation speech. It's awesome. And so I think the tower is lit yellow and blue. Like your school has stood up for Ukraine. So I think we need to stand up for that. Senator Todd Young, who's your representative here, he's great on Ukraine. There's any number of different leaders. The Ukrainian ambassador to U.S., Oksana Markarova, she studied at Indiana University. She's a Hoosier. She loves Indiana. So look, I think I'm guardedly optimistic. I think it would be a catastrophe for Ukraine to lose. We absolutely need to support them. So I worry about it too. But we need to speak up and make the case. We need to consistently make the case. And you all have an opportunity. You're in the heartland of America. Yeah, Indiana's an important state. There's a number of important representatives. I encourage Notre Dame to continue to host representatives of both Republicans and Democrats in the state of Indiana. They all want to come and speak here because this is an important institution. I think it's the largest employer in the state, or one of the largest employers in the state. Students should ask them what their position is on Ukraine. And if they've got the wrong one, educate them on how it should be. I think Notre Dame's on the right side of history on this.
A quick follow-up on this question. Maybe you can help us to understand the inner workings of the mysterious organization known as the GOP. As we look at certain GOP representatives took the president to task for this balloon. He was accused, Beijing Biden, right? Everywhere from the Texas governor, Marjorie Taylor Greene, there was a whole contingent of Republicans who came at the president and made this balloon fiasco a domestic politics issue. And it seems that those same people are the same people who are saying we need to question support for Ukraine. So can you explain to me and the folks in the room, how does that work, right? How do you at the same point call the president Beijing Biden and then turn around and say, let's remove support for Ukraine? I mean, based on the presentation you gave, that would seem a contradiction. So what's going on in the GOP?
So my point is, I think that the stakes are too high. These are really high stakes. Yeah. So I think many of the critics of President Biden in the Republican side for example, on some of those issues, I think are very irresponsible. I think they're irresponsible critiques. I think that I actually think the Biden administration has been pretty good on many. I think they've been a little slow on providing all the weapons that Ukraine needs. And I think that's been sort of a critique of some folks in the Democratic Party and certainly a number of people in the Republican Party. But I would say that there's a number of, I'd say the 20% who voted the wrong way on Ukraine are very, for the most part, people who are non-serious, irresponsible actors. And what I worry about is, it's a significant chunk of the Republican Party. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was to say, look, we need to act with responsibility, and these are historic challenges. This is not a game, and so I think that I think some of those critiques of President Biden were unwarranted and inappropriate.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to end it there, and our students, I'm sure, will stick around for some chances to engage with you, Dan. Thank you for your time.
Thanks,
I
Maura.
really appreciate you being here, and for all the students who are
Thanks, Josh.
here, some faculty who joined us, and then those of you who are with us online, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And
Okay,
will
buy at retail.
bye, retail. Thank you.